Hello, Andrea. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm really good, especially seeing you smiling and with your sparkles behind you. That's life, right?
Yes, my little
Sparkles.
lights.
That's amazing. So thank you so much for coming on today. It's just an honor to have you on, and I'm really excited to find out about you, your journey, and you're about to become a published author, so that's really exciting. So you need to tell us all about that as well, and also, just give my listeners a bit of a background about you.
Yeah, of course. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And I am a recent graduate. I just graduated from my undergrad, and my major was in international relations and literature, but I'm actually now pursuing something a bit different. I'm going into counseling. And the
Ooh.
counseling focus, yeah, the counseling focus came from the book that I started writing, the one that you
Okay.
mentioned to your listeners. And this book, I started writing it actually in my last year of undergrad. I was working on thesis, and I also was working on this project on the side. And it became just such an important part of my healing journey and just the way that I've been able to come in more into the person that I want to be. Because for a long time, I think I was abiding by a lot of things that people were telling me that I should do. And just, when there are those comments like, this would be a good major for you, it would fit your personality, or comments like that, even from professors.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you have to decide what's best for you. And this book project really illuminated that. And yeah, I'm fairly young. I just turned 22.
I know.
Actually, a month ago I turned 22, and
Oh,
I'm
wow.
just excited. I feel like
It's
I was telling my
amazing.
mom when I turned 22 that this is one of the happiest birthdays that I've had, and I think it's because for the
Yeah.
first time I feel like what I feel within is starting to show externally. And I think before there was a disconnect between that in my life, and now it's finally showing. So I felt very happy in that
Yeah.
birthday. And
So young to be a published author. Oh my goodness. I mean, you're just very self-aware, especially the genre of the book. A lot of people, they'll spend years and decades of their lives understanding about who they are, and just gaining that self-awareness, because it's not easy. It's not easy to be so self-aware. So what is it about you? Is it your parents who have obviously brought you up to be this amazing being, or do you
you're
think it's a
so
gift? Do
sweet.
you think it's a gift from God?
You're so sweet.
It's true.
It's crazy that you say that because I actually went through a lot of difficult moments growing up, and I grew up with a parent that was fairly narcissistic, very focused on his own needs and ignored the needs of others,
Mm,
especially those of my brothers and I and my mom. But
right.
my mom, what I always say, and I mentioned this in my book, wherever my father lacked, she accounted for that lack, tenfold. She was
Yeah.
always there, really grounding me and supporting me. And I think I don't know if my self-awareness comes from having gone through a lot of those years, because my father left when I was 15 and I'm just
Mm,
22. So more than half of my life was kind of spent with a parent that was verbally and emotionally abusive.
okay.
But when he left, I won't say that I was self-aware. I think I spent a lot of years
Yeah.
blaming myself for behavioral patterns that were born from the abuse that I was
Okay.
not aware of. So I
Mm,
was fairly like, my view of relationships, my view of myself was affected by that abuse.
okay.
And it was until I kind of reached this turning point, or not before the turning point came, actually, a point of depression and just misunderstanding of a lot of circumstances in my life that were very uncomfortable. And that
Okay.
discomfort, I was like, I need to address it in some way.
Yeah.
And I took therapy. I actually was in therapy for 2 months, I believe, and then I had to quit because it was very expensive. I
Okay.
live in California, and medical insurance is does cover
Yeah.
therapy sometimes, and for me, in my case, I was going through a bit of trouble with my medical insurance. So it didn't cover my therapy during the pandemic. This was around 2019, 2020, kind of like the halfway period. And it didn't cover it. So I ended up quitting therapy, and I was disillusioned by that. I won't say I wasn't, but I did end up finding tools by myself that worked for me. I mentioned journaling all the time, and also just mindfulness practices that helped. But yeah, for sure, I was not always self-aware. I did have moments where I didn't understand the way that I behaved, the way that it was affected by my past. I thought my past had no say or no stake in how I was now. But it always does, because I feel for a lot of us, we go through things that we kind of block, our brains block away. And a lot of my memories of my childhood are very foggy, and I didn't understand why until recently, where I started reading and informing myself of how trauma tends to block, our brains tend to block certain traumatic experiences because of their impact, in our persona. But yeah.
So it is. So yeah, a lot of self-awareness does tend to come from adversities and challenges that we face, and a lot of the time that is when we are younger. And I guess in your case it was throughout your whole childhood up until you were 15. And so yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. But even then, at the age of 15, a lot of adolescents at that age, teenagers even, they'd probably react very differently, because trauma can make you react in strange ways. Either people become violent, or they'll close in and become numb, and some people, like in my case, I turn to food. So there's different ways of handling that trauma.
I did that too for a period of time. I was stress eating a lot, especially in college. I was, but I also, I was turning to alcohol. What I always tell people is that it's kind of crazy for me. I was, like you were saying, when people that are younger, they tend to turn into these more harmful ways of coping. I feel that for me it happened, but it quickly shifted into just trying to find something to offset that. And it happened within the span of less than 3 years. Like, it was me really being in this pit and slump where I was doing like stress eating, I was drinking. I was just very negative. I don't know if it would be termed a depression, because I don't know if it would be, that would be the proper term. But I was in a slump, and I was doing a lot of these things. And I'm very fortunate, I think very blessed, that I was able to come out of it in less than 3 years. But a lot of people do undergo this, and it's very natural. And also to revert back into behaviors like this, like I do even now. Like, I would, yes, actually yesterday I was stress eating because I was stress eating because I'm still working on the manuscript of my book, which is coming out at the end of this year, but I'm still undergoing that
a lot of stress. Absolutely, it sounds it. And I think it is this coping mechanisms. So what are your general coping mechanisms?
My unhealthy coping mechanisms, I turn to relationships for describing these, because I think that is one of the places where they really just come to life. Especially, I was kind of afraid of I was afraid of commitment in relationships for a significant period of my life, where I would skirt away from anything about making a relationship official or just taking it to the next level. I was afraid of abandonment. I was abandoned, but before even the physical abandonment happened by my father, I was also emotionally abandoned a long time before that, because my needs weren't really catered to by this male figure in my life that I looked up to. And I was afraid of that happening in a relationship. And so I would cope by just ending it before it could even become that. And I was afraid of affection, because I didn't know how to be loved. I still struggle with that, with accepting love, because it's kind of uncomfortable for me coming from a male. And I'm still working through that. It's something that I tell people healing takes, it's never ending. It's always happening. And I mean, another I talked about alcohol being a way of coping.
Mm.
Also, I would just a lot of negative self-talk. And
Okay.
when I had negative self-talk, for me, it was kind of like comfortable. I didn't really know a situation outside of it, even though I was hurting myself when I was being negative about my appearance, negative about accomplishments that I had. I would always think, well, you were lucky in this case, that you
Mm.
accomplished this. It's not really something that speaks of my value as a person, because
Yeah.
I didn't know who I was for a long time. And
Yeah.
I'm just coming now into that. And yeah, I'm trying to think of others, but I think those are the
The
main
main
ones.
ones, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And you're right. And I think relationships are very key to anyone's growth. And it's those people who avoid relationships. I just think that, they're avoiding some very potential valuable lessons that they could learn in that relationship, because that's what relationships are there for. Therefore, to help you
Exactly.
grow and to learn from. I don't know, in my case, I avoided relationships for many, many years because I just felt like I couldn't be vulnerable with anybody, because
Hmm.
vulnerable's a huge thing, in order to have like a trusting relationship, you have to break down some barriers, and that can be so hard for any trauma survivor. Yeah.
For sure. And I think one thing that helped me begin to reframe a romantic relationship was looking at my friendships. I've never had trouble being a good friend or just accepting
Yeah.
love from a friend. And for me, reframing that idea that, romantic relationships are essentially a friendship at its
Mm.
most fundamental level. It should be a friendship
Yeah.
where you have each other's best interests at heart. And I
Yeah.
always knew that with my friends, I always had, their best interest. And I understood that if there were periods when they would go silent or not really be there, I would still, value them, and I wouldn't walk away from being their friend because they were, not really being present in the connection. So
Yeah.
I started thinking, if I already respect this in a friendship and I understand it, why can I transfer that to a romantic relationship and view it
Mm.
in the same way? And when I started doing that reframing, it was really helpful. And I also
Yeah.
had a close childhood friend that he's a male, and our friendship is always about mutual respect and just understanding that we're in different walks of life, but we have each other's best interest at heart. And that reframing for me has been very useful in thinking of relationships, and how, even if the person starts doing things like not replying to my text messages, or just, doing like he's away. I mean, I would stress about
Yeah.
very things that I shouldn't be stressed about. Like they wouldn't reply and they would take longer, like an hour to reply. I would
Yeah.
already be thinking, what did I do wrong? Is there
God.
something
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
on?
And
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy because we all get offended very easily, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of I guess that could boil down to maybe lack of security within oneself.
Right.
When you get really irate because someone hasn't responded, and it's like an ultimate rejection for a lot of people. So yeah, it can really play out different you know
Insecurities of the
yeah,
person.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, and again, when you're self-aware, it's about kind of understanding, your thought patterns, like during that hour when you're not, when you haven't received that message, what's going on in your head?
Mm-hmm.
That's what interests me. It's those,
Exactly.
because I know times when I'd just start creating this crazy, just false situation.
False narratives.
Yeah. You know all
No,
about them, don't
definitely.
you?
I do. No, I think we
Wow.
live in our heads a lot of the time, and the reality is so different from the narratives that we craft in
Mm,
our brains, from fear, from insecurities. And yeah, I mean, I'm still battling. Like, one of the biggest things that I've told people that I'm still working through, and I mentioned this in my book, is self-love. I think
mm,
self-love is the core of a lot of things that are tied to my trauma.
yeah.
And self-love is such a complex topic, because I've now reframed it, as I could understand it now, as just a sense of being enough. And
Yeah.
I think that I can understand feeling like I'm enough at this point, but I still struggle to love parts of myself that that are tied to the 15 years that I spent alongside someone that was abusive.
Yeah.
And that is a process. I'm like being compassionate with myself, knowing that, I'm young. And even if I wasn't, time is measured and not really like linearly, and especially healing is not measured linearly.
Mm.
There are moments where I would revert back to how I used to think of myself. And honestly, I think I've come a long way. When I look at my journal
Mm.
entries, I
Yeah.
see the negative self-talk and how it's decreased over time.
Brilliant.
And reading over my book too, I was noticing that in some of those first chapters, I was very harsh with the way I analyzed myself. Yeah. And then later on, I was like, oh, it's my language is becoming kinder. And that was really
Oh,
neat to see.
nice. That is,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh my goodness, yeah. I suppose because how long ago did you write those first two chapters?
I wrote them at the start of this year. So at the start of I started
Okay.
writing my book at the start of 2021. But I was
Wow.
writing them in retrospect because a lot
Yeah.
of the things that happened occurred since 2018.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's, yeah.
But still, you've come a long way from the beginning of this year. I mean, that's a huge growth for you to even look back just for, a few months ago and think, wow, I was a bit hard on myself here. It's time
Mhm.
to maybe reword some sentences. Is that what you did?
Right. Yeah. And my editor was actually telling me, because she was looking over my first chapters, and she
Mm,
said, this sounds a little bit harsh. Maybe you should
mm.
change it. And I told her, well, I wanted to keep it that way because it shows readers that that's actually how I was thinking at that time.
Yeah,
And,
authenticity.
yeah. And when they look at the later chapters, the ones towards the end of the book, they can
Mm,
notice that shift in
yeah.
language and way of expressing how I feel of myself.
So tell us about your book. Tell us kind of, any research you had to do to write the book and any help you got and, what it is. What are the chapters? You don't have to go through all the
Yeah.
chapters, of course, but yeah,
No, no.
just an overview.
Yeah, my book actually changed from the original idea that I had. My first
Mm,
instinct was to write about my own journey through understanding my trauma in the first half of the book, or the first third of the book. And then the middle of the book would be the stories of the people that I met, that I interviewed throughout actually my last year of undergrad. I was doing a lot of interviews through Zoom with strangers that I
okay.
met,
Oh,
that I reached out to, that I knew were working in, fields like counseling, but also just being teachers and from all professions, all walks of life.
yeah.
And they were talking about inner peace, which was kind of what I reached out using. My question was, how do you define inner peace in your life? It was kind of
Mm,
a vague question, but I wanted it to be vague so
yeah.
people could bring up their life stories. I was kind of just very, very curious to see the resemblance between those stories. I
Oh,
think human beings are more connected than we
mm,
sometimes believe ourselves to be.
yeah.
And that really came across when I spoke to these people. And then the third part of the book was going to be talking about, once we understand ourselves and we
Mm,
understand our connection to others, it's
yeah.
easier for us to serve. And that third part was going to be about service and how it comes across in very different ways. And it could
Okay.
be naturally attributed to the way that you process things.
Mm.
And that third part is no longer in my first book. My editor was just telling me that would be a second book. I think, I don't think that
Oh,
would be, a first book. But now the core of the book is talking about my way of processing my trauma,
yeah.
and this concept of interconnected healing, which brings to the second part of the book, which are the stories of
Mm.
these people. And the concept is, I don't think it's been created by others. I've read of one psychologist that is just working in her practice, I think in Texas, and she mentioned interconnected, what did she say, well-being. But
Okay.
I just said interconnected healing is when we recognize the oneness between our stories and those of others,
Yeah.
and how we get energized by seeing that
Mm.
oneness to work through our own trauma. And
Wow.
that's kind of what the book is about. Like the first couple of chapters are about my way of breaking down my discomfort with
Mm.
relationships, and
Okay.
kind of how that triggered remembering my trauma of 15 years with my father,
Right.
and working through that to really understand also the family trauma, because I think sometimes we don't, we go through trauma collectively, but we don't recognize how we go through it very differently. Even if we were in the same situation, we process it very differently. And I had to hold that empathy for my brothers and for my mother, and really coming to terms with that. And then that second part, just, how the stories of, now there are 9 individuals, before there were 22 because it led to service, the third part.
Yeah.
But now with these 9 individuals, I just talk about their stories and, tie them back to my own. And yeah, it's kind of a unique structure. My editor was telling me too, she said, I've never seen this before.
I know, to be honest, mine was as well. I was
Yeah.
also told that my book should have been 3 separate books, but you know what? I wanted to add value. I wanted it to be like everything in one book, like a kind of do it all kind of procedure in my book.
Same.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it, how we think the same about this, whereas editors are obviously thinking about probably the audience.
And they're also thinking of other books in the genre. I'm sure, my book was originally termed a nonfiction, and now it's a creative nonfiction. And then, there was another layer. It was a memoir, creative nonfiction.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah,
it was boxed into those categories.
That's why. Yeah, and I guess it makes it harder now. It's like, what
Yeah.
genre is this? It's like a
What
nobody.
audience?
Yeah, absolutely. But I suppose it's catered for trauma survivors.
And
right?
anyone really that is looking into self-development. Oh, and you mentioned what research I did for the book. I didn't address that. But yeah, I looked into with this concept, and your listeners, I really recommend that they look into Dr. Andrea Pennington. We have the same name.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Yeah, when I found out, I was like, that's so cool. But she was actually originally a doctor that was very just focused on traditional ways of treating, like in America. But now she's looking more into integrative ways of helping others through what she calls narrative therapy. And that's a big concept in my book. Narrative therapy is reframing your life circumstances to yourself. Like if you underwent trauma or any other life challenging circumstance, you reframe it in a way where you can better understand it, to see that you were not the antagonist in your story, but you were actually a victim. Like your podcast is about recognizing the challenges and working through them in whatever way works for you. And a lot of people, sometimes when they are victims of abuse, they don't really see themselves, they cannot even label it abuse. I struggled a lot to label what I went through abuse. I thought that it was too serious of a category or too heavy of a category to actually attribute it to my story. But through this narrative therapy, you begin to work through your past in order to see it more clearly and to be energized by the things that you can start unraveling, and really just putting yourself as a protagonist and seeing those connections. And for me, through that narrative therapy, I also saw that become clear for me through the stories of other people in my book. It was kind of like a therapy session every time I spoke to them. If I'm completely honest, I had a story of a woman. She was 40 years old, I believe, in her early 40s. And she shared her story of being abused by her father, but she was also physically abused. And through her speaking of her story, and she spoke of her unhealthy coping mechanisms, and one of them was using men. For her, it was to feel a certain hint of control in her life, because she felt so like she didn't have any control over her circumstances. And when she was in relationships, she felt a little bit of that control. And for me, it was to feel validation. But when we were speaking, I was telling her that I felt so powerless by being in this position. I'm like, I want to be happy alone and just be able to be enough for myself. And I don't know, is there something wrong with me for being this way? And she was like, this is completely normal. You were a victim of abuse, and your abuse makes you, see things differently from the way that people that haven't undergone a similar circumstance would view them. And just speaking to her about that, and also just hearing how she overcame the cycle of abuse in her family. Her mom was also, verbally and physically abused.
Yeah.
It was very life-changing to be able to see myself reflected in another person, in another woman, and view an alternative to the scenario that I had in my mind that I would end up playing out for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Which was very negative. And Drew, which is the name of this woman, she also has a book that just came out called The Darkness Within.
Okay.
It's such a great book. She talks about getting actually a mental illness from her abuse. She was diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. And yeah, I mean, stories like that, it was, like I say, a kind of a therapy session within an hour. And she was a stranger, and I took so much from her story, and we're friends now to this day. We like text each other, and yeah, she's amazing.
And I suppose because of this, now you're wanting to pursue your career as a counselor as well, therapist.
Yeah, it's crazy. I feel like I was growing up, I always thought I would want to work with people, to hear them out and just help them work through their stories in some way, through their trauma, through their just self-development. And I always had that inkling, but I never tied it to a profession. Like I did that with everything else. I went through all of the professions you can think of. I thought I was going to be a doctor, then I thought I was going to be a teacher and a lawyer. And I never thought of counseling and therapy until one day I was just looking at my book. I was looking at the chapters, and my editor told me, how would you label the key themes of this book? And then I spoke about mental health. I spoke about, self-improvement, trauma, healing. And she said, well, those are all mental, topics in the mental health field. And she was telling me, maybe you would be a good therapist or a good counselor. And it clicked. Sometimes we have to be told by somebody because our brains don't put 2 and 2 together. But yeah, now I'm looking into that. And I'm actually applying to a program right now in counseling.
Oh, amazing. And I think you've set yourself up perfectly for this, because your book will be read by many, many people across the globe. And and I just think, you'll have a lot come from this as well. Just I think as well, what's important is to understand that, your age and, the kind of other survivors out there who are around your age or even younger. It'd be interesting to kind of hear your views on, what you feel needs to change for people to become more self-aware, and what do you think the greatest challenges are for people, the younger generation, Generation Z, Generation X's? Is it? Would you class yourself as a millennial?
I think so. Yeah, I was born in 1989.
Okay. Yes, I
that
think
little threshold. I'm actually been so happy to see in like my social media and just people that are my age that I know, on Facebook, Instagram, that they're starting to post a lot more about mental health and just becoming more aware of sometimes in our society today, the way that images and lives are portrayed online. They're portrayed in a very inauthentic way. I had days, I remember when I was going through my period of being in a slump, I would scroll online and I would see these perfect lives and just, very curated images. And I thought, well, my life is kind of a turmoil in the midst of all of this. And I think now people are starting to, at least people that I know my age, they're starting to post a lot more about the way that their thoughts influence their reality and just becoming more aware of those little nuances. But I think what has to change, and I think I would have told this to my younger self. I mean, I'm young, but I would have told this to my even younger self. I speak like I'm a 40-year-old woman.
You have an old soul, don't you?
I don't know. My mom tells me this very funny story. It's a quick story. I think I was like, she tells me I was 4 or 5. And my dad had actually just come, we had all come from Mexico. I was born in Mexico, and we came
Okay.
to the US, and my dad bought a new car, and he was with his car every single day. Like, he was cleaning his car. He would wake up, and the first thing he would do is just go and do something for his car. And one day we were sitting in our porch and my dad was out taking care of his car. And then I looked over at my mom and I told her, I was like 4 when I said this. I said, Mom, I think if the house were to ever burn down, my dad would save the car before our family.
Oh,
And she
wow.
just looked at me like, how did you come up with that thought? And honestly, I didn't believe her when she said that, but she tells me stories, like little stories like this.
Yeah.
But going back to the point of what I think would have to change is just people knowing that, therapy is such a helpful resource. And I always, when I say this, I really reinforce that, because therapy helped me a lot. But
Mm.
it's not the only avenue for beginning to work through trauma, and just, being in a state where you feel disillusioned, or you just feel like there's no way of beginning to work through a lot of the things that are making you sad or making you feel hopeless about your reality. I feel when I started therapy, I thought it was one of the only avenues I had. I waited to start healing, or to start thinking of healing, until I had my first therapy session. And then when they ended in 2 months, I was like, if I would have stopped thinking of healing then, I wouldn't be writing this book. I wouldn't be speaking to you today. And, I took it upon myself to do something that worked for me. And I think there are so many resources that, unfortunately, sometimes our generation is not aware of, that are
Mm.
tied to healing. For me, dancing, whenever I dance, just like silly dance, just do, whatever I
Yeah.
want, move my body, I feel just this rush of joy, and just, being able to feel at peace.
Yeah.
And afterwards, when I have that, I start thinking and reframing whatever I was depressed about or just anxious about. I start reframing it, because that experience allowed me to have a new perspective of things.
Mm.
And, if our generation started, seeing those little ways that different activities that are unique to you can start helping you work through, I don't know, whatever is hindering you, it's
Mm.
transformational. And another thing I would say, I think relationships are very, I don't know, in our day and age, I think people, when they go into a relationship, not everyone, but just, some of them, they go in thinking that it's going to fix a certain aspect of themselves. That,
Yeah.
I was like that. I am one of those people. I was one of those people.
Yeah.
I went in thinking that it was a missing piece, or, something that would end up adding, and it does add, but it adds more when you first do that addition to yourself,
Mm.
by feeling, some level of contentment within, and really being aware of how your triggers that are still tied to whatever you went through, show up in relationships. They really, I see it with friends, and I see it with my brothers too. And
Yeah.
I tell them that, it's important to be self-aware, in that sense that, you're who you are is always a unique individual, even if you are in a connection with somebody else. So whatever you're carrying from your past, or just from things that are unresolved, they're going to show up in that connection, one way or another. And I don't know, maybe just that. And from our generation, I feel I'm very hopeful. There are like so many people that are my age, that are beginning to speak about mental health in a new light. But I just think there should be more, like, making the healing process be less complex
Yeah.
than what a lot of people make it out to be, because it isn't. It is what works for you, and just being
Mm.
open-minded and
Mm.
compassionate for
Yeah.
yourself and for other people.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And I think that's a very important point, that a lot of people are starting to be more authentic and starting to understand that, whatever we see on social media, it's not always what it is, what we think it is. So yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. But also, I think it's amazing that you are out there now, spreading your light and wisdom with everybody. So where do you see the future? Will we be
So
seeing another book, do you think? Or
Yeah, I would love to speak, do some form of motivational speaking, or just, really speak about my book to a larger audience. Right now, I actually have, my mom tells me this. She says, you're just starting off with this
Good.
process of writing and hopefully speaking. And I have this like talk that I'm doing at my university and also at my high school.
Wow.
Those are kind of the two places that I've, been that are bigger at this age bracket.
Yeah.
But you start off with anything. You start off, even if I
Yeah,
just
that's
had a Zoom
amazing.
call with like a couple of
Yeah,
people that wanted to join, I would be
exactly.
happy.
Oh, wow.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I that's one of the things that I'm, looking forward to. And, if the book gets a bigger response and I end up being able to speak to more people or just interact with others, if, Drew, actually the woman that I interviewed, it was her first book too, and it just got released in August, the end of August. And she's had a lot of people reach out to her, speaking of their own stories, overcoming
Wow.
abuse.
Mm.
And for Drew, that's been so rewarding. And,
Yeah.
that could be something that happens for me. I would be super grateful and happy. But in the future, I would, love to be hopefully giving therapy, having my own private practice,
Nice.
and just, spreading positivity and light and hope,
Mm.
especially hope in these times. I
Yeah.
feel a lot of us
Yeah.
are very scared, anxious about the state of our world. But there are so many reasons to be grateful, and
Yeah.
literally just being able to breathe and being able to take in life. And
Mm.
yeah, I don't know.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
just excited about what's ahead.
Me too. I'm so excited for you, and I cannot wait for your book to be out. And hopefully, our paths will cross again. And where can my listeners find you in the meantime?
Yeah, just thank you for having me. I just wanted to say that first of all.
It's a pleasure.
And
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
your listeners can find me at my website. So it's
Mm,
www.authorandreamedina.com, and also on my Instagram, which is Andrea Medina _author.
lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll also be adding those links onto the profile. So, well, that kind of is the ending of the show. And I just wanted to, again, say thank you for your time today, for sharing your wisdom and your light. And I'm sure that, a lot of my listeners will be inspired by your journey. And hopefully, it might inspire my listeners to go out and write their own story, because we all have a story
Yes.
and every story counts. It's,
Just to add one final thing to that,
yeah.
I stumbled upon so many people when I told them that I wrote a book that said, I've
Mm,
always had this inkling to write a book, but my
yeah.
story is probably not going to resonate with someone, or it's too late for
Oh,
me to write a book. And I would tell them, you're so wrong. Like if I
that's
had
so,
all of the books, yeah, if I had all the books of people that think their stories are not worthy, I know that I would be so enriched by all of these untold
wow.
narratives. And
Yeah.
our world is filled with untold narratives that need to be shed light on.
Mm,
So if you're thinking of writing a book, if you're thinking of sharing your story in any other medium, if it's through YouTube, if it's through a podcast,
yeah.
through just making videos and uploading them to a website, whatever works. I
Just get
really
out
think
there.
people can benefit from it. Mhm.
Yeah, it is. And there's a lot of healing, isn't there, as well, when people share their
Yes,
story with others.
yes.
For me, I think this has been the biggest healing, just, talking, because I think
Mm.
when you come from a suppressed society, suppressed culture, being vocal about what's happened to you, it's not, it's not the norm. And this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make it the norm. And,
It's a great and admirable thing to do.
this is it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So, everybody, Andrea Medina, I will add her links in the profile of the podcast or of the YouTube video, which wherever you're listening to this podcast or video from. And yeah, if you do have any questions, then please do let myself know, or you can also contact Andrea via Instagram or her website. And any question that you have, please do fire it away. If it's about this episode, about Andrea's book, which is coming out at the end of the year, right?
In December, yeah.
Lovely. So I would just like to say congratulations on this, and also best of luck on the launch.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So keep in touch, and thank you for listening, everybody out there, and I shall see you on the next show.